And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Josh Silva. On this week's episode, Frank Sinatra, his life and times and best hits, and during this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up. The first album is called In the Wee Small Hours, released in 1955. This one's a beautiful compilation of ballads. It's a compilation of melancholy blues-themed tracks featuring guitar, celesta, piano and string instrumentals. It was also his follow-up album to a previous album called Songs for Young Lovers. The album's known as a concept album, one that tells a story through the music. And the theme was his mourning for his recent breakup with actress Ava Gardner. Another album called September of My Years, released in 1965. This album saw Frank Sinatra moving into new territory. It was an experimental album and one of his best from the 60s. The album comprises a series of reflective, meditative tracks. The theme of this album is the passage of time. The songs range from pop to jazz to folk. And an album called The Song Is You, released in 1994. This album compilation comprises some of Frank Sinatra's best performances alongside the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra that he toured alongside. Many of the songs are beautiful romantic ballads. It's also a glimpse into his early days as a performer. So that was a quick recap of the albums that we're going to be discussing during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Josh Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Josh Silva. On this week's episode, Frank Sinatra, his life and times and best hits, and during this hour, we're going to be talking about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called In the Wee Small Hours. This is one of Sinatra's best albums for Capitol Records and sees him pairing up with Nelson Riddle as arranger. So this album is one that utilizes one theme throughout the music. It's known as a concept album for that reason. The theme in this album is a longing for lost love, a despondent lover seeking his lost love. So basically Sinatra is expressing his mourning through the music. And yet the moodiness of the album is its outstanding feature, best listened to when in a reflective mood. Some of the highlights: In the Wee Small Hours of the Morning, setting the theme for the entire album; Mood Indigo, a very catchy song. There are several great renditions of the song out there like Duke Ellington's, and Frank Sinatra's one of the best. Glad to Be Unhappy is a great filler and builds up the momentum. What Is This Thing Called Love has a great instrumental backdrop to Sinatra's vocals. The next album is called September of My Years. This album was recorded in 1956 and is a deviation from his usual up-tempo albums. This one's also a concept album, one that tells a story through the music. The tracks all adhere to a particular theme or concept. The concept or theme in this album is time, the passage of time, reflectiveness on the changes that come with time. The background orchestral consists of a symphony including 9 vocalists. Overall, the album's a late-night jazz-style album with a reflective mood. The moods in the album vary from contemplation of love affairs in bygone days to a realization of mortality. Sinatra sings warmly and intensely about things like changing leaves, the onset of winter, and youthful dreams. The title track sets a scene of contemplation and reflection. Songs like Hello Young Lovers and Don't Wait Too Long amp up the tempo. In many ways, the album celebrates love. One of the standout tracks from the album, It Was a Very Good Year, went on to win Sinatra a Grammy Award for Best Vocal Performance in 1966. His arranger, Gordon Jenkins, also won a Grammy for Best Instrument Arrangement. The song is a beautiful folk song that plays out as an instrumental and vocal perfection. An album called The Song Is You, released in 1994. This album contains collaboration specials between Tommy Dorsey's orchestra and Frank Sinatra. Frank was one of Tommy's bandmates in the 40s, and several of his performances with him are recorded here. An outstanding feature of this album is Tommy Dorsey's trombone playing. Frank singing alongside several other vocalists including Joe Stafford and the Pied Pipers and more. This was Frank Sinatra in his early days, before he developed his unique style. His performances synchronized perfectly with the Tommy Dorsey Orchestra. The album also comes with an introductory booklet showcasing moments shared between Tommy Dorsey and Frank Sinatra. Frank left the Dorsey Orchestra in 1943 and began his career of ballad singing. The music in this album is less bouncy than his songs for Columbia Records that came later. There's also a lot of brass and string instrumentals backing his vocals. So that was some insight into some of Frank Sinatra's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Josh Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Josh Silva. On this week's episode, Frank Sinatra, his life and times and best hits, and now it's time for some trending album news. Al Jarreau was one of the leading vocalists from the Hall of Fame of Jazz. He was a multiple Grammy Award-winning musician whose style combined pop and jazz themes, and he was famous for his hits Morning, We're in This Love Together, and more. So they've just unearthed a series of previously unreleased live radio performances by Al Jarreau in a compilation called Wow. The performance took place in DC in front of a live audience when Jarreau was still in his early days, and the complete set of songs is going up for release on November 29th as part of Record Store Day's Black Friday event. It's also available for CD and digital download on December 6th. Al Jarreau was backed by a trio led by Tom Koenig on keyboards. So it was 1976 when Jarreau had just released his second studio album Glow for Reprise Records. To promote the release of his album, he was performing at a live concert in DC on WHFS radio. He performed some great hits in the compilation like We Got By, Rainbow in Your Eyes, Take 5 and more. The original series of songs went undiscovered for nearly 40 years until recently when it was discovered by another superstar, Grammy-nominated producer Zev Feldman. So Wow is a great insight into Jarreau in his early days, also an insight into him performing before a live audience. For more information, please visit aljarreau.com. And that was some trending album news on the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. When we come back, we're going to be talking about more of Frank Sinatra's best albums of all time. Stay tuned. And welcome back to the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Frank Sinatra, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. Here's a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour. The first album is called Watertown, released in 1970. This is another great concept album from Frank Sinatra's compilation that tells a story through the music. The story of Watertown is centered around a man whose wife has left him for the big city. The singer is singing about his loss and heartbreak, and each song is like a letter to his wife. The songs combine to give an atmosphere of loneliness that tell his story. Another album called Songs for Swinging Lovers, released in 1956. This album came after the massively successful In the Wee Small Hours. It's a similar album, except the theme in this one is not brokenheartedness but joyfulness. There's a lot of fabulous love songs in the album like You Make Me Feel So Young, I Thought About You and more. Overall, a compilation of swing music covered in Sinatra's vocals. And an album called Francis Albert Sinatra and Antonio Carlos Jobim, released in 1967. This was Sinatra's venture into the bossa nova genre of jazz, and this album sees him take on a series of Brazilian jazz songs. He was collaborating with the founder of the bossa nova genre, Antonio Carlos Jobim. The album contains jazz standards and original works by Jobim. Jobim's on guitar and background vocals. The result was a Latin-themed jazz album supported by brass, percussion, string and guitar music. So that was a quick recap of what's coming up during this hour, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. We're going for a short break. We'll be right back after that. Stay tuned. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Joshua Silva. On this week's episode, Frank Sinatra, his life and times and best hits. And during this hour, we're going to be talking about more of his best albums of all time. The first album is called Watertown, released in 1970. When this album was first released, it wasn't instantly popular, racking up just 35,000 sales in its initial days. It's a concept album telling the story of a man who's lost his wife for the big city. Despite its initial lack of success, it went on to become a masterpiece in later years. This was a unique album for Sinatra. It was his only album of original compositions written specifically for him. Also, it was a concept album, an album with one theme throughout the songs. It was also the first time he overdubbed vocals separately from the music. The story of Watertown is sad. It starts off with a man whose wife leaves him for the big city. He is despondent and hopeless. Then he goes to a train station on a sunny day hoping to see her again, and she doesn't turn up. And suddenly it starts raining. The songwriters Bob Holmes and Jake Prompts designed the songs in this album very differently from Sinatra's usual format. For one thing, this album is also a deviation from the typical settings of Frank Sinatra's songs. They're typically set in a luxurious, exciting place. Watertown is a different setting, a sordid environment. One of the highlights, the song I Would Be in Love Anyway, tells the story of a sad marriage that was the reason things went wrong. Another song, She Said, plays out as a letter from Elizabeth to her husband, backed by percussion and string instrumentals. Another song called Michael and Peter, where the singer is begging Elizabeth to return. The song Elizabeth is a beautiful electric guitar solo. Overall, the mood is unchanging and the songs form a narrative that Sinatra brings to life with his vocals. Another album called Songs for Swinging Lovers. This is another great album, came 4 years after Sinatra's Wee Small Hours, and it takes us through some beautiful love songs from the Great American Songbook. This album is different than In the Wee Small Hours in terms of texture. The former was one of depression and sorrow. This album is full of joyful love songs. The first track in the album is taken from a movie soundtrack, Three Little Girls in Blue, and Sinatra's rendition of the song is fabulous. A happy-go-lucky song with horn music backing. It Happened in Monterey is another classic that plays out as a swing song in the album. I've Got You Under My Skin, another up-tempo swinging song. And an album called Francis Albert Sinatra and Antonio Carlos Jobim, released in 1967. In this album, we see a collaboration between Antonio Carlos Jobim and Frank Sinatra. It was recorded in Hollywood in 1967. Sinatra had just completed a successful run with the Reprise label. Antonio Carlos Jobim was in the essence of the bossa nova genre, which he had pioneered. That was one reason Sinatra wanted to team up with Jobim. His status as a singer was being offset by the increasing popularity of the Beatles, and his style was different than the increasing trend towards Beatles-style music. The bossa nova genre enabled him to gain a foothold in a music style more down his line. The result was a beautiful compilation of Latin rhythm-themed songs. Sinatra is soft and gentle on the vocals, and he's supported by an orchestra of brass, percussion and guitar music. It was a massive success. The album entered the top 20 position on the Billboard charts and stayed there for 28 weeks. It also brought about a unison between bossa nova and pop music at the time. So that was some insight into more of Frank Sinatra's best albums of all time, and this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We're going for a short break, we'll be right back after that. And this is the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. We've come to an end of today's episode of the Jazz Update, so now it's time to recap what we were talking about during this program. On this week's episode of the Jazz Update, Frank Sinatra, one of the leading vocalists of the 20th century. Some of his best hits included Love and Marriage, Strangers in the Night, and New York, New York. He grew up in New Jersey touring alongside local bands. He was inspired to take up music full-time after watching Bing Crosby performing in the mid-1930s. In 1940, he joined Tommy Dorsey's orchestra. After a successful stint with Dorsey's orchestra, he started out solo. As a solo artist, Sinatra attained widespread fame, gaining a reputation as the voice and the Sultan of Swoon. In 1943, he also started performing in movies. Some of his best movie roles were in films like The Manchurian Candidate, From Here to Eternity, and The Man with the Golden Arm. In 1950, he founded the Reprise label, on which he released more hit singles and albums. He went on to win multiple Grammy Awards for his music. So that was a quick recap of his biography. Now let's talk about some of his best albums of all time. The first one's called In the Wee Small Hours, released in 1955. This one's a compilation of ballads. It's a compilation of melancholy blues themed tracks featuring guitar, celesta, piano, and string instrumentals. It was also his follow-up album to a previous album called Songs for Young Lovers. The album is known as a concept album, one that tells a story through the music. Another album called September of My Ears, released in 1965. The album comprises a series of reflective, meditative tracks. The theme of this album is the passage of time. Sinatra at the Sands was released in 1966. This album offers us a glimpse into Frank Sinatra's performances in the 60s. It was his first live album release and was recorded during a concert in Las Vegas. Frank was collaborating alongside the Count Basie Orchestra during the concert, with Quincy Jones as conductor. There's a mix of jazz classics and lesser heard pieces. The Basie Orchestra are also in top form. Overall, a very dynamic performance by Sinatra and the Basie Orchestra. Songs for Swinging Lovers was released in 1956. This album came after the massively successful In the Wee Small Hours. It's a similar album, except the theme of this one is not brokenheartedness but joyfulness. There's a lot of fabulous love songs in the album, like You Make Me Feel So Young, I Thought About You, and more. Overall, a compilation of swing music covered in Sinatra's vocals. And an album called Francis Albert Sinatra and Antonio Carlos Jobim, released in 1967. This was Sinatra's venture into the bossa nova genre of jazz, and this album sees him take on a series of Brazilian jazz songs. The album contains jazz standards and original works by Jobim. Jobim's on guitar and background vocals. The result was a Latin-themed jazz album supported by brass, percussion, string, and guitar music. So that was a quick recap of everything that we discussed on this week's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan De Silva. You can check out the archives of today's program on my YouTube channel, The Weekend Jazz Update with Jashan. So on that note, we've come to an end of today's episode of the Weekend Jazz Update. I'll see you again next week. Have a great week ahead.